Welcome back to Ideology. I'm Mick Murray here with Drew Stedman across the pond. And last week we started a conversation that was hopefully an uplifting, hopeful. Today the topic will be more on hope specifically, but conversation about the state of the church, what God's been doing in America in particular. But I think we could maybe extrapolate this out to the broader Western world. Talking about the move of the Spirit in our modern times, especially around this theme of peace and this message of peace that the person of Jesus is bringing to a postmodern society, and the amazing things are happening all around us, and celebrating that, becoming aware of that, and then not just diagnosing, why we think that is happening and why others think this is happening, but also what is our response to it? How can we, as the body of Christ, be prepared to steward this harvest? What does discipleship look like in this context? And so on and so forth. So if you missed last week, go back and take a listen. I say week, last episode, not sure the intervals at which these episodes will be released, as we are doing this remotely now, but definitely go back and take a listen to the last episode as we dive into a conversation centered on hope. And again, these conversations are around some of the data that's been coming out that Barna has released recently on statistically the amount of people who are identifying as born again followers of Jesus, especially in the kind of 30 and unders. And so without further ado, Drew, why don't you take us into a conversation on hope, building on the theme of peace.
So if last week we talked about being and non-being, and then we linked that to identity and peace, that's kind of the direction of where we went, for a short summary. Today, I want to talk about transcendence within an immanent world and link that to hope. And we'll work in a couple other ideas as well. So we're going to talk about transcendence today and the significance of it. So I had this experience, I don't know, a month or two ago here in Hawaii. We were driving on our island and stopped in a small town. And as we were walking by this building, sometimes you see these bulletin boards where people advertise all these different things that you can do in the community, and a lot of really great stuff. But I started noticing all these very interesting spiritual type of things that people were doing, and it was cow cuddling, which I'm not saying that's inherently spiritual. I do feel like it would be really terrible and hard to justify eating cheeseburgers after you've cuddled a cow, but cow cuddling is an option for you. But then it got like all kinds of out there, it's like astrology while listening to whale noises.
Cow cuddling isn't out there.
Cow cuddling is out there, but it got more out there. I was thinking like whatever crazy thing you could imagine, like we're going to paint upside down, listening to dolphins shrieking, and it's going to be under a full moon, or whatever. It's like all that kind of stuff, right? And it's just like a whole bulletin board filled with things like that, these relatively, spiritual, neo-pagan, new age type things. And I think growing up in a charismatic world, I think as a child, I would or even as a young adult, so associate that all with like spiritual warfare. We're going to fight against it in the spirit. And yeah, there's a place for that kind of thing. But it was interesting to me looking at this bulletin board. I didn't feel any of that. Instead, what I felt was sadness. And my sadness, of course, there's a sadness for people who are far from God. But what I realized is this is the desperate attempt of people who have no genuine transcendence in their life, are trying to create some type of transcendental experience, some type of experience that enables them to transcend themselves and the reality of a material world that they are trapped within, fully immanent to, with no meaning or hope beyond it. They're grasping for something, is what I saw. And I saw this as almost like a cry for help, and it's, if you want to cuddle cows, like, I don't care, it's fine. If you like listening to whale noises, be my guest. Mick, you might be listening to whale noises right now. I don't actually know what's going on in that office of yours. I don't have a problem. I have a problem trying to engage the spiritual world apart from Christ. I think that's a dangerous thing to do. But to me, the point is not the activity. The point was what felt like a pretty obvious lack of transcendence in people's lives, and the desperate attempts at people trying to find something, anything that will give them transcendent meaning and purpose.
And maybe
Now,
just real quick pause, Drew. Sorry. So immanence and transcendence, we're using those words are really central to this episode. To attempt a very brief definition, would you agree that we're talking about immanence in the sense that like reality is within the known world, within the material world, and transcendence would be that there's a reality outside of the material world? Is that more or less kind of what you're getting at?
yeah, I would
Okay.
use immanence to describe the universe as I experience it, universe in the way that I can know it, that I can manipulate it, that I can interact with it with my sensory experience or with mathematical equation, anything that's material or derived from the material world. It's the world in which I inhabit on a daily basis and I participate in and I am an agent within. That's the immanent world. Transcendent is beyond. It's what is beyond my capacity to know. It's beyond my ability to manipulate or to generate some kind of experience through my own agency and power. So we're talking about two ways of relating. Historically, if we could go back in time, most human cultures lived with a sense of a spiritually transcendent world. And that could have taken a lot of shapes. That could have been animism and spiritism, where there are river gods and tree gods and sun gods that need to be appeased in some way, or could get into various forms of idolatry, where you have these idols or mythological beings that have to be worshipped. It could be some of the monotheistic religions that have cropped up, including Judaism, Christianity, Islam, things like that. So there's a lot of different things, but most human beings, as far as I'm aware, have lived in both worlds. There has been the understanding of a transcendent spiritual world, and maybe if we wanted to get really technical, maybe sometimes the ways that people engage the spiritual world was a blending of transcendence and immanence. Where you had gods, but the gods were very much active in the world and could be manipulated by human agents. And then you get into the world's great religions, where we started to develop and become aware that God is beyond our ability to manipulate. And if God is truly transcendent, if God, for example, can create the world out of nothing, then there's nothing within me that can manipulate God in any way. He transcends my ability to even know him. And kind of coming into that reality. So you look at a human history, most people would have had these moments where they were acutely aware that there is more to this world than what I can perceive with my eyes. There is more going on than what I can manipulate. And that could be a really beautiful thing. It could also be an oppressive thing. A trend I've noticed, and maybe to fast forward my history lesson, is the last couple hundred years, the world has been evacuated of transcendent meaning in so many ways. And some of that is scientific discovery. And, we've learned maybe natural phenomenon that has historically been attributed to the gods is now understood as forces of nature. And that's allowed for all kinds of discovery. So we always have to be careful not to paint things as black and white. I mean, this is there has been a lot of wonderful discovery that's come from this. But what's happened over time is the world has been increasingly understood as a closed causal system, meaning there's nothing beyond the world that's interacting with the world that's doing anything to it. It's operating on its own terms, and the material world is all that there is. And if I were to develop that out a little bit further, I think maybe peak modern thought. Let's say, I don't know, the turn of the 19th century going into the 20th century. Somewhere in that time frame. It was, this idea was like, we can know the world. We're on this optimistic view of all the world's going to have an explanation. We're going to really master the material world. We'll be able to manipulate it for human progress. And this is what there is. And anything beyond is superstition. It's the vestige of our ancestors trying to make sense of the world. But now that we have modern science, we know better, and there's no transcendence beyond what's here. So let's make the most of what's here and morally face the future with hope and, doing all of that kind of within the human sphere and human agency and immanence, living within the material world. So if that's like a really terrible history lesson of, going from a transcendent world to that's where, the last 100 years people were. And then what happened though, is I would say the last 100 years, and really could go back to the English Romantics, I think were some of the first to really see this. And, we could look at these other different movements that have come along. But it's this recognition that a world that is only material, that exists to be manipulated by the humans that live upon it, is a very impoverished world. There's not a lot of inherent meaning to a world like that. What we experience are resources to be used, and there's no meaning beyond it. And so it creates a real existential problem. And I'm using that word technically because we ask the question, like, what is existence? What's the point of it? Why, why any of it? And the people who've stared that in the face have recoiled in horror, because they realize, like, if this is all there is, there's no morals, there's no meaning. In some ways, like even beauty, or some of the things that we hold to be true, wisdom, beauty, goodness, all these different things, they start to lose any kind of meaning because really those are just human constructs to make sense of a material world, and that's all there is. And what I believe has happened over the course of the last 100, 200 years is that is operating in the background for most people. And most people don't actually believe that. If I went and interviewed people and I asked them, is there more to this world than what I can manipulate materially or we can make sense of with our science? I'm positive that the majority of people would believe there's something beyond that. It's just there's been a tie that's been cut. And I referenced a guy named Hans Boersma last week or last episode, and that's his book, Heavenly Participation. That's what he talks about. Charles Taylor, who we've talked about, he talks about this. There's been this tie that's been cut where there is the material world that we can know with certainty, and then whatever else is beyond can't really be known. And so we just have to kind of accept that it's out there, but it can't be made sense of. So all we can do is find existential meaning in this life through the things that we choose to do to give ourselves meaning. That's really where a lot of things have landed for so many people. And so to fast forward to cow cuddling, what I see with that is I see generations of people who haven't had real transcendent meaning. And so they're trying to create it. And the problem is they can't go back in time to what their ancestors had. And so I can't go back in time to, my Germanic ancestors or my whatever culture you come from. We are incapable of re-inhabiting the world that they lived within because we know that there's not a river god that decides to flood or to provide famine based on the number of sacrifices that were provided to it this year. We know that. We know instead it's ocean currents and El Nino or La Nina in the Pacific Ocean that then affect weather patterns around the globe or whatever, whatever the case may be. And so we can't go back. It's actually literally impossible for us to re-inhabit this pre-modern world that had transcendent meaning. It's impossible. So now what we have to do is figure out how do we find transcendence in the world that we live in today. And there's just this deep poverty for people. And to pull it back in, why is there so much spiritual hunger right now? I think this is one of the factors, is that a world that has no meaning is a world that has no hope. And so what people end up doing is they're grasping for things, and the things they're grasping for are increasingly ridiculous, and it's too easy of a target to pick on. But actually, I think the better emotion is sadness, to be like, man, it's sad to me that we're so impoverished in our belief system that I'm having to resort to things that even my pagan ancestors would have thought is stupid, and that's the level that we're at right now because we don't have a real rich, tethered, multi-layered belief system that provides transcendent meaning within an immanent world and a belief system that's able to incorporate things like science or the development of history. And so I think a lot of people, it's like they want to have it all, but they're incapable of putting the pieces back together. And I think it's provoked this existential crisis.
Yeah. So to reiterate what you're saying, Drew, so throughout most of history and in some parts of the world today, the kind of the predominant belief system was, or understanding of reality was transcendent in that we inhabit a reality that within which participates deities, beings, gods that are outside of our ability to control, to grasp, and there was a kind of a haunting effect at times to appease the gods, but there was kind of this trafficking of the spiritual in this transcendent frame, and then with the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, and then the Industrial Revolution. And the ability to identify and name, kind of beginning with nominalism, to be able to name the natural phenomena that, lightning and thunder isn't just the gods tussling, but it's a natural phenomenon that we can identify and predict and so on and so forth. And And instead of landing in the middle of this balance of the transcendent and the immanent, modern um, modern Westerners, especially maybe in the academy and in the sciences, swung all the way to the other end of the spectrum, that everything is immanent, that there is nothing transcendent, which brings its own kind of haunting reality that we're trapped in this immanent frame, that there is no meaning outside of my own subjective experience. And so the coping mechanisms that we see, I remember reading, I think it was How Then Shall We Live by Francis Schaeffer. I'm not sure if it was that book or another one by him, but he talks about the compassion that he felt when he would talk with true materialists, and he was like, I didn't want to engage them to try to prove a point, because I knew that the implications of what I was trying to show them could be so devastating, uh, to really highlight the meaninglessness of life apart from the transcendent. And so he talks about the compassion for aching souls that he felt, that this longing for transcendence is birthed out of an ache, that we're tethered to the eternal. We're tethered to desiring something that's bigger than ourselves. And so um, this was a theme last week, but at an interpersonal level, carrying compassion for a world around us that is aching for the transcendent, even if cow cuddling gives us a chuckle at times.
Yeah, and it's, I look at what I see. It's interesting to see the resurgence of astrology, which anyone who's studying, if I kind of have a scientific mind, it's really hard to be somebody who's been influenced by modern science and to give any credence to astrology, right? But there's a ton of people that are really into astrology, and I think a lot of those people probably live with tension where they kind of deep down inside know this probably isn't like an accurate thing in the world, but they need something. They need something that's beyond them to give identity and hope and meaning to who they are. And maybe on a more serious level, even a resurgence of paganism, where people are overtly going back into some form of neo-paganism, and that some people would own it, other people maybe not so much owning it, but they're really interested in kind of the mythology or the idols that 300-400 years ago their ancestors used to worship, or going back 1,500 years, depending on where you live. I see all of that kind of thing that's happening, and all of that that I can tell is a cry for transcendence. It's a cry for meaning. Now, what's sad is there's a reason why their ancestors got rid of those idols, and they had transcendence, but it came at a really terrible price. And so if you go to a true animistic or pagan culture, our ancestors, they were haunted by a spiritual world that must constantly be appeased. And so they had transcendence, but they also had to sacrifice their children to appease the sun god. It's not like that was a world that had a lot of great love and purpose and joy either. They just had different problems than we do. But moderns, we're not haunted by the spirits. The spirits have all been banished. They've been kicked out. They don't live here anymore. There is no spiritual world for a modern. Instead, we're haunted by an immanent world that's devoid of meaning, which in some ways is just as terrifying to deal with. And I'm not sure it's going to be possible to build enduring societies and cultures in a world where this world is all that there is. I think a lot of what I see in the modern world is parasitic on its Christian's roots and heritage and history that gave it meaning and purpose. And the further and further that wears off, the greater the existential crisis and the more skepticism I have about even the ability to see enduring cultures and beauty and art and development, because it's a world without meaning. So what's the inspiration for any of that other than my own existential desire to make some kind of meaning out of something?
Mhm.
So you take that hopelessness in a meaningless world, hopelessness in a meaningless world. And that's why we try anything that'll give us transcendent purpose. We'll attach ourselves to it to find meaning. Now, I'm talking about spiritual things. I also think this is why a lot of people associate themselves with some kind of cause. Like they'll just adopt a cause, and it's not transcendent in the technical sense of the word because it's still immanent, but at least it's something that's much greater than them that gives meaning to them. And I'm not saying that a lot of people don't have really good motives for the causes that they believe in. Even if I disagree with the cause, like I can acknowledge the importance of us being socially active and involved in certain things. But I don't have any way to prove this. You guys listening can see if it bears true. But I think for a lot of people, there's a thin line between a cause and an identity. It's looking for transcendent purpose. And so I'm going to throw my lot in with some kind of cause that feels like it's greater than me. And I can devote myself to this cause. And this cause is going to fill that void of meaning in my life. And so it's not transcendence. I'm not going that far with it, but it's a transcendent like experience that allows me to have something beyond me that gives meaning to me. I've noted with some people where it seems like they're the angry activist type, and it could be any side of the political ledger, the angry activist type. And at times I've wondered what would happen to that person if their cause, everything they wanted for happened. I think they'd actually be really miserable. I don't think they could handle not having that cause that they're angry about, because that cause that they're angry about is what can give purpose and meaning. And of course, there's plenty of people that are active in causes where it would be their greatest joy to see it, to see whatever injustice abolished. And so I don't want to try to pinpoint any one person as much as just acknowledge. I think that's also, that quest for transcendence causes us to run after all kinds of things to fill that gap that gives us meaning in this life.
Hmm. Yeah, to go back to what you were just saying about, can a society even function in a truly, like a purely immanent frame? And made me think of Os Guinness, and we've mentioned his name before on this podcast, but he talks about the triangle of first principles, where um, in a free in a free society, it requires virtue. Freedom requires virtue in that citizens have to be self-governing, as opposed to like a pure autocracy or dictatorship. But virtue requires faith at some level, and Sam Harris and others would disagree with this, but virtue is rooted in some kind of moral frame, some kind of moral conviction, and then ironically, faith, at least, um, faith doesn't require freedom, but in a society, a faith that's informing the virtuous kind of underpinnings of a society requires freedom. That true faith can't be coerced; it has to be freely chosen. And so, this interplay of freedom and virtue and faith, and he kind of poses the question that, as society continues to fracture into kind of a secular, humanistic belief system, and departs from the Judeo-Christian underpinnings that a lot of the forebears of our nation held, can a free and just society um, persist? And I think it's an interesting thought experiment. But I think that lends back into this conversation about hope, getting off track just a little bit, but um, that it's extremely hopeful that there's been this swing back towards the faith in Jesus Christ that could potentially help this kind of democratic experiment persist into the future.
There's something really powerful about our faith. And so if we kind of build off what you just said, Mick, and turn the corner, how do we tell a better story or make better meaning of the world that we inhabit? And in our faith, there is this powerful link between transcendence and immanence, where both of them are taken with radical seriousness. And I think that's the thing. That's the maybe a distinctive thing that we can run with here, is that on the one hand, we uphold an incredibly honoring transcendent view of God, so much so that I cannot know God except for the terms by which God makes himself known. And I believe in a God, not that controls the power of a river. I believe in a God that created the whole cosmos with a breath. And so I have this view of God that is so far transcendent beyond the possibility of human knowledge. My finite brain could never even make sense of this God. And this God who created me is the God that gives me purpose. It's interesting that in Greek, the word logos is what's associated with Christ the Son, in John's gospel in particular. But logos means form. It's like the blueprint. And so God himself is what gives form to the universe. And so there's inherent meaning to it. And that meaning transcends anything that's in this universe. The universe does not give form to itself, but it's given a form. It's given an identity, like we talked about last week. And it's given an ordering that comes straight from God. And so it's transcendent. And then, of course, if I was going to go further, we've talked a lot about what I love about Pentecostal theology. You don't just have to be a Pentecostal, of course, every tradition of the church, but we believe in a Holy Spirit who's active in the life of the church. And so not only is there a transcendent reality that's beyond us, but that transcendent reality is with us. And so I
Oh.
have experience of God. I have revelation of God. I have these moments. Sometimes they're ecstatic moments. Sometimes they're moments of profound peace. Sometimes they're moments of the inbreaking of the kingdom of heaven where God shows up in power. All of these things happen. And, then at the core of our faith is the person of Jesus. And if you think of transcendence and immanence, that is the cross. That is the person
Hmm.
of Jesus. It is transcendent God who becomes man and joins with us in this life. Like that is the exact reconciliation of transcendence and immanence. And both of them are fully and completely honored. And I think the witness of the church, Jesus must be fully God and he must be fully man. We're not degrading one for the sake of the honor. And so this life is valued. It could not be more valued. I mean, the God who created the world, the word who formed the earth is the word who became man and then enables us to become new man. Like that's amazing.
Hmm.
There's no better way to honor the material world other than the fact that God would join himself to us. And at the same time, it also is this persistent reminder that there are meaning and purpose and hope and our ultimate being, like we talked about last time, is also beyond this world. It's rooted and anchored in God himself. And so you see this, you see even in a triune maybe way of framing it, we see the Father who spoke all things into existence, but then we see the Father sending the Son and the Son and the Father sending the Spirit. And so there is transcendence beyond us in Father, Son, and Spirit, eternal time, past, present, and future. We have that, but then we also have the missions of the Son and the Spirit. So they're with us in this world, and we can actually experience them and have access to transcendent reality within the immanence of this world. And then I could add another layer to it is that this world is created good. So despite whatever flaws are here, the material world has meaning because the material world is created by the word of God. And yes, there is a process of reconciliation and redemption and renewal that must take place in this world. But there's also an inherent dignity and goodness to what is material because that which is not material gave the material world its meaning. And so if you follow this out, it's like there is such a rich depth of understanding of the world in which we live that has meaning that's beyond us and honoring what is here in front of us. That's the heritage. That's the treasure of the church that we get to speak back into a world that's lost its sense of meaning and purpose.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting, thinking about Jesus. This meditation on the transcendence and the immanence of God has been kind of a staple for my devotional life for the past multiple years now, and it's rooted in some reflections that we don't have time for in this episode. But um, I was thinking about like the claim that Jesus made while he was in the flesh that he and the Father were one. It so incited the Jews that Yahweh, like you were just saying, the transcendent being of the universe who spoke and the cosmos came into being, that this person who, was a certain height and had a certain eye color and a certain hair texture and it grew up in a very obscure part of the world at a random, seemingly random time, arbitrary time, that this person would claim to be Yahweh, and they didn't have any trouble grasping his immanence because he was there, but they had trouble grasping his transcendence. But in the modern age, or like for modern Christians, it's often harder to grasp God's immanence because he's not physically present, and we interact. It's also hard for us to grasp the transcendence because we lack imagination, but we understand that God is outside of us. But it's harder to connect sometimes with the gritty humanity of Jesus and the you talk about the goodness of the terrestrial world that is inherent because it was created by God. And even in our eschatology, thinking about, one day we'll leave all this behind and go to heaven. But the message of the scriptures is that the earth is going to be renewed and we will spend eternity on the new earth in a very familiar setting that's free of the curse and decay and so on and so forth. And I just want to put that forth as fodder for meditation for all of us, our listeners, for us, that the transcendence and the immanence of God, that a God who cannot be fully known, who is outside of time and space, who sees the beginning from the end, and boggles the mind when we begin to try to conceive of his nature, is also accessible, knowable, that we can meaningfully interact with him by his spirit, that those two realities exist simultaneously is an utter blowaway and should just lead to tremendous wonder and worship and awe.
Yeah, it's you can't overdo it, in a sense. And I found in my own spiritual life, there are times where it's one of those. I have to just become enamored with it, and then it'll be the other, and it's those two together that provide meaning and anchoring to the world. It's the hypostatic union is the theological term, but it's the joining, the mysterious joining of the full divinity and the full humanity of Christ. And if he is the paradigm for the new humanity, then I can't be ontologically God in the same way that Jesus was, but by the Spirit in Christ, I am joined into the life of God. And so I have access to that transcendent meaning, purpose, identity, even as I live in a graced humanity. And it's like all of that comes together. And yeah, you're absolutely right, Mick. All of those make me fall to my knees in worship. And I just get caught up in the beauty of it, the majesty of it. And then meaning flows downstream from that. And so I don't have to make meaning in this world. I was just thinking of like, I'm not to pick on the cow cuddling people. If that's your jam, go for it. Listen to
Hey,
worship
I
music,
would,
maybe.
I'd be happy to cuddle a cow, a calf. I don't know about a cow, but
There's
it
a
could be
lot
therapy.
nearby. Could you get one of your friends? We know people that have cows. Can somebody listening invite Mick to your ranch and let him give this a go?
Hey, I would, there's goat yoga. I mean, you could like, I guess, calf yoga. You get some calves walking on you while you're, it's, to
Would you
each his
listen
own.
to whale noises while you're doing it, though?
Maybe not, but I do, while we're nerding out for just a moment, I do have a new app on my phone that is the, the Merlin Bird ID app, and it's really cool. It's free, so hey, if you're into birds, download it. But you can, if you're outside and like birds are chirping, you can open it up and it identifies just by listening to the bird calls. And it could be like 10 bird calls going on simultaneously, and it'll show you exactly what's around. And it has totally hijacked my walks and my time with God recently. I can't go like 20 feet and I hear a new bird call and I get my phone out and I'm like, ooh, an Eastern Phoebe. I hadn't heard that one yet.
That's so awesome. Can you give us
So
your best bird noise, Mick?
no, I can't. I'm not even going to attempt. But I have
That's too
gotten to
bad.
where I can identify now at least three of the northern cardinal calls by ear,
This
as well as the Carolina wren, if you're curious.
this is awesome. Cow cuddling and bird noises. I love it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
I'm not a huge leap from cow cuddling.
no, you're on that trajectory. And so yeah, I would love to have a video. That could be maybe next episode. You could show us some pictures of you cuddling a calf. Um, so I have no problem with, at one level, we all have our quirky, I'm not like bashing cow cuddling I am bashing astrology, but not cow cuddling. But my point being, when you live in a world where you have that joining of transcendence and immanence, you don't need those things for identity. You can have hobbies, but I'm not looking for something to give me transcendent meaning within a material world that's devoid of it. And that's the heritage that we have as believers. And I was driving by seeing all those like spiritual signs, and I was thinking about these moments I've had where the power of God showed up and we're like on our faces in front of a living God. The God who conquered all the pagan idols of history. It's like that same God who can banish demonic spirits with a word, like that God who shows up in tangible ways. And I don't need those other things, like they're just very cheap substitutes from the real thing when you've touched the real thing. And that same God turns around and gives me meaning in the very intricate details of my immanent world. And there's so much life and so much hope there. Make something you brought up though that I want to maybe end with is not only do we have all the things we've talked about, but you mentioned eschatology. And there is an ultimate reconciliation of transcendence and immanence in the eschaton at the end of time when Christ returns and inaugurates the new heavens, the new earth, and his eternal kingdom. Then we see the full and complete reconciliation of these different things. So I have hope just in the fact that I'm created by a transcendent God who gives me meaning in this life, that my humanity is in Christ. Like I have hope in those things, but then I also have hope in the guarantee of what the future holds, of knowing that whatever happens in this life and the winds and waves of the, short short time that I inhabit on this earth are not what provide meaning to me ultimately, but what provides meaning to me ultimately is who I will be in Christ forever. And I already am that person, and I am becoming that person, and I will be that person. And all three of those things are true simultaneously, but my hope is grounded in what will be because of what is in Christ. And so I have hope just because of that. But I have meaning because something that is outside of me has given meaning to me, and that is grounded in the future. So I can face the future with incredible hope. And even beyond death, I can have hope. Even if what is created in this life, the things that give me meaning in this life, even if all of those were taken away from me, of course, it'd be terribly painful for anyone who's ever experienced that in this world. But we have a hope that's untouched by even that, because our hope is found in what will be in the future. And the transcendent God who formed the world is the same God who's going to reform the world, and ultimately is the one who grounds our identity and grounds our purpose. So when I think about a world that has no meaning, and I think about the message that's inherent to the gospel of who we are, and the joining of transcendent God within the material world, who one day will return again and will establish all things. Like, that's the story. That's the world that we live in as believers. And I believe, to build off of last week, I believe that what's driving so much hunger in the world around us is the emptiness, is the lack of hope and the lack of purpose. And we have exactly the opposite of that for those who are in Christ. And so I've said many times that theology is the treasure of the church. And I see this as an opportunity in a world that's so desperate to represent the treasure of the church. And I'll just give one last short cultural thought. I think a lot of people today that are spiritually hungry, they're not people that have the same kind of church baggage that people a generation ago had. Maybe even people our age, Mick, or people older than us, where they grew up in a little bit of a Christian world, and then for some reason or another, they walked away from that. What I see today are people who never inhabited a Christian world. They don't know it. They don't understand it. And that was the Barna stat we read last time. It was predominantly people that were not church are the ones coming to Jesus. And sometimes it's easy to despise the house you came from, even if the house you came from was a good house. And I don't want to make light of the reforms that are needed within the church. Of course, that's there. I don't want to make light of someone who had a really bad experience in a church. Of course, that's there. But what I do want to point out is that the secular alternative isn't that good. And the people who've lived with a secular alternative end up with a lot of need. And they're the ones that perceive, wow, there's something in the church. There's something in the purposes and the identity of who we are in God that's so much richer than what I can find in the secular world. And those are the same people that are leading this return. And so as a pastor, I want to make sure that the churches that we facilitate and the community and discipleship is healthy enough so that these people who are so spiritually hungry find lasting discipleship in life. But I also think it's something that we could just take a step back and be like, of course, this is what's happening, because people are so desperate for meaning and for purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe my last reflection, kind of circling back to one idea before that, those remarks, but this marrying of the transcendent and the immanent. I know we've made light of cow cuddling multiple times, but you said, there are certain things like astrology where we're trying to connect with the transcendent through means that are harmful, that are unbiblical, that are not rooted in the medium of Jesus Christ. But for the believer who inhabits both the immanent and the transcendent frame, it animates all of life. And
Mhm.
so we can participate in things like, I was at a concert recently, and it was a transcendent experience for me. That music can kind of transport us in this amazing way. But it is a means, not an end in and of itself. And so it's a means at times to connect with, with God and nature and all these other ways that God's given us to connect with Him. And I think that is an apologetic for the church in this age, to marry the two, to be very much in the world and present, and celebrating God's goodness in creation, and not, gnostically, if we can use that as an adverb, um, rejecting the terrestrial world for only the transcendent, but bringing the transcendent and the immanent together and enjoying a full life at peace with tremendous hope for the future and for the present, that God is in the business of redeeming even this present age by the work of the Spirit. So, with those reflections, maybe a good point to put a pin in it for today, Drew.
That's great.
And yeah, thank you for your ongoing listenership. We really appreciate it. And we haven't mentioned it in a while, but you can connect with us, ask questions, give suggestions. We'd love to hear from you at ideologypc at gmail.com, ideologypc at gmail.com. And we are on YouTube and Instagram still at ideologypc. And we will catch you next time on Ideology.